Chapter 7 of Seminar 20 begins with that famous diagram, that table of sexuation that you've probably seen before. If you haven't, I've thrown it up on the screen here for you. This is from page 78 of the English translation, and it's precisely where this tangled and torrid Chapter 7 begins. Now, the good news here is that everything you see in this diagram at the start of Chapter 7 in Seminar 20 is material we've already discussed. There's really nothing new here. However, some of this material, like that barred woman that you see, is newer than the rest. So let's start, as we often do, with what we already know, with those 4 formulas of sexuation at the top of this table, because this is also how Lacan begins. Now, he assumes that you're already familiar with these formulas. And truth be told, since you've been tuning in to these series lectures on Lacan, he's right. You are familiar with these formulas at this point. So I think it's safe for us to just jump right in with him on page 79. 78 gives us the diagram, and by 79, he's in there explaining these formulas at the top. And he's going to start on the left-hand side, telling us about masculinity. Check it out. We begin reading on page 79. We'll start with the 4 propositional formulas at the top of the table, Lacan says, 2 of which lie to the left, the other 2 to the right. Every speaking being situates itself on one side or the other. And that may be the point at which you just say, no, dude is wrong. However, in order to say that you think this is wrong, I believe it's important to really dig in and understand what exactly he's working with here. It's a big claim on his part, but one that I think is all too often misunderstood. So don't be hasty here. On the left, the lower line, and here he's referring to the left-hand side of the table, the second formula, the lower formula that looks like an upside-down capital AX next to capital phi X. Here what he says is, this indicates that it is through the phallic function that man as whole acquires his inscription, with the proviso that this function is limited due to the existence of an x by which the function phi x is negated. And here now he's referring to the formula above it, the one that reads, there exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. So the first formula at the bottom says all masculine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. But he's saying in order for this whole enterprise of masculinity to hang together, there has to be, and here's the formula above it, in existence someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Hence that bar above the phi x, it means negation. And that's why he's emphasizing negation here. That, he tells us, is what is known as the father function, whereby we find, via negation, the proposition capital phi x with a bar over the top of it, which grounds the operativity of what makes up for the sexual relationship with castration, insofar as that relationship is in no way inscribable. The whole here is thus based on the exception posited as endpoint. That is, on that which altogether negates the phallic function. Here again written with a capital phi next to an x. Again, I don't think there's anything new here. Sometimes the way Lacan talks and the way that things are translated, it comes across as being kind of startling. Just hang tight. I don't think there's anything actually new here. And it's not anything here that we haven't already discussed. So let me just highlight a couple of parts or aspects of what you just heard regarding masculinity. First, note the exception logic here. What Lacan is saying is that the whole, complete, total set of all men presupposes, even if only phantasmatically, an exceptional man, a no man, which props up the whole, complete, total subsumption of every man under the phallic function. It really is that simple, and it really does lend itself to that old saying we've been messing with. Remember, If everything is included, that means nothing has been left out. And this nothing for Lacan is indeed something to consider. That's the hook here. If everything is packed for the camping trip, it means that nothing has been forgotten, nothing has been left out. And this for Lacan is precisely the point of inquiry. What is this nothing, this no thing, that needs to be excluded in order for the count of everything to hold? And we could even be a little more playful with this. So everybody, repeat after me. Psychoanalysis is meontological. It is not an inquiry into being. It is not an inquiry into para-being. Instead, it is a discourse on non-being. Psychoanalysis is a meontology because it is a discourse on non-being, meon, not ontology, but non-being, meontology from the Greek. It's a discourse on all the nothings on which self, society, cosmos, and universals of every stripe are founded. You want to produce the one, you want to produce the everything, you want to produce the all. Lacan is right in thinking logically that you then have to consider what is necessarily excluded. This nothing that has to be left out in order for everything to hold together. Psychoanalysis is the study of this nothing. Now that's a lot to repeat. Like I said, we're being playful here. But I think this brings us to the second highlight I want to call your attention to from these passages on pages 79 to 80 of Seminar 20. It's the bit about negation. Negation is complicated stuff. Lacan even acknowledges at one point very clearly, like, there are multiple forms of negation here. Which one are we talking about? Negation, though, is a centerpiece of the passage you just heard. So let's see if we can unpack this a little further. In keeping with everything you already know about the so-called father function, about that infamous no of the father, with all its castrative potential, Lacan, I think, is here emphasizing the bar over his formula for that exceptional real man that masculine subjects never stop fantasizing about. So masculine subjects, you see them figured in the lower left-hand formula at the top of the table. All masculine subjects is governed by the phallic function. Here what we're asking about is the real man that props up their position in the phallic field. This real man is that of the father. This real utterance of this real man is that no that we've talked so much about in all its castrative potential. And that's partly what he's suggesting with that negation above the phallic function in the upper formula. The upper formula that designates this mythical real man that masculine subjects never stop fantasizing about. We've talked about all this. This is more or less what our series on Seminar 19 is about. But here, I think we can sum it up rather well. His enjoyment, the enjoyment of this mythical real man in masculine fantasy, it not only exceeds the phallic function. Pay attention here. It also, and this part is crucial, negates it. That's Lacan's point about the mythical father. It not only exceeds the phallic function, but negates it. Hence that myth of the father of the primal horde that Lacan's been poking at since Seminar 17, ourselves as well. He doesn't enjoy in terms of the phallic function this exceptional real man, nor does he even enjoy atop it. Instead, the mythical father of the primal horde enjoys at the expense of the phallic function, or so the myth goes. What this allows us to say are things like this. If feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function is additive, the math of manly enjoyment, or at least our fantasies thereof, is subtractive. Let me explain. And I think it's important to do so here because it allows us to highlight an essential yet often overlooked distinction between the masculine myth of enjoyment unconstrained by the phallic function, which is what you see in that upper formula in the masculine side, and the feminine logic of enjoyment beyond the phallic function, the formula of which we'll discuss in a moment. Let's be clear about this. Both of these enjoyments are fucking impossible, but in different ways. There cannot be a masculine subject, big, bad, uncastrated, paternal, primordial, or otherwise, whose enjoyment is not governed by the phallic function. Why? Because all masculine enjoyment is so governed. To elude this governance would also be to shed one's masculinity. So, what then is that real man that masculine subjects never stop fantasizing about? One more ego ideal for them to fail to live up to. Notice, an ego ideal. This is all discussed in our series on Seminar 19B or worse. So I'll leave it here because we got other things we need to talk about in this infamous Chapter 7 in Seminar 20. Let's shift then to the feminine side. On the feminine side, I told you there's also an impossible enjoyment, but that this impossibility functions differently from that on which masculinity depends. On the feminine side, we see another impossible enjoyment. It's the one we've been considering in this series. Feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function, as we've established, cannot exist and cannot fail in this enterprise of non-existence. This is about where we are relative to this impossible enjoyment. It cannot exist and it cannot fail in this enterprise of non-existence. However, this aspect of feminine enjoyment does not proceed by way of negation. Instead, as you've often heard me say, its operational logic is one of a both and, additive, as you just heard me describe it. So check this out. Masculine enjoyment, as captured in Lacan's two formulas of masculine sexuation that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the diagram on the screen. It's built like an either-or. You're either a real man who enjoys without limit, or a weak one whose enjoyment is ever constrained by the phallic function. You're either the father or among his sons. You're either an uncut daddy or one of his castrated lessers. Let me put this a bit harshly, because that's exactly what this field of masculinity enacts. You're either the big dog, represented by the upper formula, or just another bitch, which is what the lower formula of masculinity indicates. Suffice it to say, like Lacan, I don't have much admiration for masculine modes of enjoyment. I appreciate them for what they are. Sometimes they're useful. I'm happy to figure them out with Lacan, but I don't want that for myself. And I don't think you probably do for you either. Note, between these ethers and these ors that prop up masculinity, I think we see the structural logic of a certain negation, the very one that we've been discussing here. Real men, big dogs, uncut daddies, if they were to exist, and of course they don't, they would be 100% subtracted from the phallic function. For them, the phallic function would be null and void, completely zeroed out, reduced to nothing. In short, negated. Not so, however, as we have learned, with feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function. Her impossible enjoyment marks an addition to the phallic function, not its negation. Again, the operational logic here is that of a both and. Some of her enjoyment remains phallic, even if only contingently so, but not all of it, of course. Some of her enjoyment also exceeds the phallic field. So, how then do feminized subjects enjoy? With one foot in the phallic field and one foot outside it. If all masculine enjoyment is necessarily phallic, some of hers is contingently so, and the rest impossibly so. Like I said, you've heard all this before. All of which suggests two interrelated but ultimately distinct ways of being in the world of phallic enjoyment. There's one in which you never stop fantasizing about ideal egos and ego ideals, each a phantasmatic figure of oneness, and each impossible for you to experience except in the imaginary. Or a way of being in the world of phallic enjoyment in which you let go of all that shit, embrace multiplicity, and thus gain access to the phallic field along with something more. Access also to a realm of lived, embodied experience that, however impossible, is no less real as a result. Indeed, you can feel it in your bones, and you can say as much to others. So there's your choice: masculine imaginarium or mystical real. But we're talking about chapter 7 here. I don't want to get too far afield. As you start reading through this chapter, you realize the first half is a commentary on the diagram that you're seeing on your screen, that famous one from page 78. Once he has flitted through the masculine side, he's ready to talk about the feminine side. So what you'll see at the top of page 80 is that he shifts to the other side of the diagram, to the side of the other, to that of the other sex, by which he means the feminine subject. The goods start again at the top of page 80. I'll read it for you if you don't have the book in front of you. On the other side, so here Lacan is shifting to the right-hand side, upper level of his table, you have the inscription of the woman portion of speaking beings. Any speaking whatsoever as is expressly formulated in Freudian theory, whether provided with the attributes of masculinity, attributes that remain to be determined, or not, is allowed to inscribe itself in this part. We've been hammering on this point. Here's another clear reference to it. Any speaking being whatsoever, masculine or feminine, is allowed to inscribe itself in this part. And note the move here. The masculine subject, if they are male, would shed their masculinity in order to become feminine. It doesn't make them less male. It means that they now enjoy according to feminine logics. That's Lacan's point here. Penises or vulvas don't matter. It's about how you enjoy. And what he's saying is that the field of enjoyment known as feminine is open to all. A masculine subject could switch it up, in other words, and learn to enjoy like a feminine one. If it inscribes itself there, it will not allow for any universality. This is what you forfeit. As you drop the masculine and embrace the feminine, you lose access to that all, to that whole, to universality, to man with a capital M. It will be not whole, insofar as it has the choice of positing itself in capital Phi X, the phallic function, or of not being there. Again, we've heard all this before, so let me just focus on a couple of highlights here. First, feminine enjoyment, as you just heard me unpack, is open to all. Men and women alike, non-binary folk as well, along with anybody else you can know or imagine, they're all welcome on the feminine side of things. Remember, it's not about who you enjoy. It's not about what you enjoy. It's about how you enjoy. Everybody can, and if you're listening to me, I'm telling you, everybody probably should learn to enjoy as a feminine subject. And let me tell you, many people already do enjoy as feminine subjects, and many do so without even knowing it. I'll leave them to your imagination as well. Second highlight. If negation featured prominently in our last passage on the masculine side of things, positionality again figures largely here. Once more, Lacan is thinking spatially, just as he's been thinking spatially with regard to feminine enjoyment since the start of Seminar 20. Feminine enjoyment positions those who experience it in and beyond the phallic function. They are a part of and a part from the field of phallic jouissance. And as a direct result of this, check it out, they are not wholly anywhere. Some, but not all of their enjoyment is phallic. But note, by this same logic, some, but not all of their enjoyment is also elsewhere. Which has allowed us to reach another set of conclusions, like this one. If masculine enjoyment is embroiled in part-whole wagers, ever in hopes of arriving at self-sufficiency, feminine enjoyment operates according to a part-not-whole logic that allows for self-satisfaction. Note that shift. The masculine side of things is founded on a part-whole wager, ever in service to that autonomy here, that self-sufficiency that men fantasize about at the level of that big dog we've been discussing. Feminine enjoyment, however, does not operate according to a part-whole logic. Its logic is one of part-not-whole, and it allows for something different. Not a fantasy of self-sufficiency, but a reality comprised of self-satisfaction. Again, it comes down to choosing your impossibility here. Man is whole due to a fantastical, non-existent exception, that masculine fantasy of a real man. A fantasy that all men long to realize for themselves, but never do. It remains just that, a fantasy. Woman doesn't exist due to the fact that women are not whole, not totalizable, not oneifiable, and fucking content with this, according to Lacan. Now, having reviewed some key themes regarding masculine and feminine enjoyment, you won't be surprised to see Lacan then shifting to the newish for him and his audience at this time, bottom quadrants of his diagram. Now I can tell you, if they had eyes to see and ears to hear, they would also note that a lot of what's happening in the lower part of the diagram on the screen in front of you, that famous one from page 78, is also stuff that he's already discussed. From Seminar 18 forward, I wager you can find each and every element in here. Now that we've got woman slashed out, maybe that's the newest of them, but the rest, man, they're all point for him. So what he's doing here is he wants to shift, now that he's talked about the masculine formulas and the feminine formulas, to all that weird wonky shit in the lower portion. The variables, the elements, the vectors, and what's going on. He wants to try and explain some of this. First up, he says, is that slashed S on the masculine side, with an arrow pointing to little a on the feminine side. Let me show you how he winds this thing up. It's on page 80, and it's crystal clear stuff. I think it's actually quite good. This slashed S, Lacan says on page 80, never deals with anything by way of a partner, but object A inscribed on the other side of the bar. He is unable to attain his sexual partner, who is the big O other, but not as you might think it, except inasmuch as his partner is the cause of his desire. In this respect, as is indicated elsewhere in my graphs, by the oriented conjunction of barred S and little italicized A, split subject and objet A, this is nothing other than fantasy. Here again is the part-whole logic of masculinity, the one we've been discussing in this series. Partners reduced to parts to help masculinized subjects feel whole, by which, of course, I mean autonomous, self-sufficient, just like the mythical father of the primordial horde. You know, that exceptional real man whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Or again, so the fantasy goes. And note the crucial clarification here. Masculine subjects enjoy their partners in parts. Indeed, they enjoy them to pieces, but never in full, as whole beings. Herself, like her jouissance, is never fully, completely, wholly there in the field of phallic enjoyment, and thus never fully, completely, wholly accessible to those she meets there, particularly of the masculine stripe. Relative to these boys, and all the more so when they fantasize about exploiting her parts to allow themselves to feel like bigger, badder boys, she remains a figure of the other, of an other which does not and cannot exist in the field of phallic enjoyment, of what Lacan here calls a radical other. And this, if you ask me, is the centerpiece of Chapter 7. To get us started on this, recall the last lecture where we ironed out some preliminary parts of this. When I say radical big O other following Lacan, I'm not talking about the big other, which, as we learned long ago, is no such thing. I'm talking about that motherfucker's big barred truth. And this, I think, is where things get very interesting. When Lacan talks about the jouissance of the body that symbolizes the big O other, the body in question is feminine. And its symbolic status, like that of the other it signals, is barred. What then are women in Lacan's thought? Exactly what they've been since he began formulating them in Seminar 18. They are signifiers of the big barred other, the algebraic symbol of which is even older, stretching back to the graph of desire, a capital S next to a slashed capital A in parentheses. Note, Lacan is still at it here in Seminar 20. I call your attention once more to page 80. It is improper to call her woman, la femme, because, as I stressed last time, as soon as woman is enunciated by way of a not whole, the W cannot be written. There is only barred woman here. Woman with a line through it, as you see it on the diagram in front of you, is related to the signifier of capital A insofar as it is barred. I will illustrate that for you today. This is indeed what Lacan is trying to illustrate in Chapter 7. The question that we have is whether and to what extent he actually does this. I think we can help in this way, but he says this is what he's up to in this lesson from the spring of 1973. Slashed out woman is related to barred big A. The signifier of barred big A is indeed that of slashed out woman, and he wants to illustrate that for us today. Notice what he does, though. In service to this goal, he then shifts to another aspect in the lower part of his famous diagram, the arrow from barred woman to the signifier of the big barred other. But as he does this, he also adds an arrow from slashed woman that you see pointing left to capital Phi. We'll come to those in a moment. I want you to notice, though, how he works back up to this arrow from slashed woman to signifier of the barred other. It's an important move that he's making in the midst of all of this. Notice how he works up to it, notably in the next few paragraphs. And note that when he says other again in these paragraphs, he means the barred other. Not a capital A, but a slashed capital A, just as it appeared in his no less famous Graph of Desire years earlier. So like I said, he's on the same tip here. Page 81 gives us some great passages to show you how Lacan is reformulating and rethinking and continuing his thought around woman in her relation to signifiers of the big barred other. The other is not simply the locus in which truth stammers. It deserves to represent that to which woman is fundamentally related. Assuredly, we have but sporadic testimonies of this, sporadic mystical testimonies. Don't forget what he was up to in the previous chapter. And that is why I took them up last time in their metaphorical function. Being the other, in the most radical sense in the sexual relationship, in relation to what can be said of the unconscious, woman is that which has a relationship to that other. That is what I would like to articulate a little more precisely today. Woman has a relation to the signifier of that other. Insofar as qua other, it can but remain forever other. I can only assume here that you will recall my statement that there is no big other of the big other. The big other, that is, the locus in which everything that can be articulated on the basis of the signifier comes to be inscribed. What a great definition of that classic Lacanian big other. This, he says, is, in its foundation, the big other in the most radical sense. That is why the signifier, with this open parenthesis, marks the other as barred, capital S, slashed big A in parens. How can we conceive of the fact that the other can be, in some sense, that to which half, since it is also roughly the biological proportion, half of all speaking beings refer? That is nevertheless what is written on the blackboard with the arrow that begins from slashed woman. Slashed woman cannot be said. Nothing can be said of woman. Woman has a relation with the signifier of the big barred other. And it is already in that respect that she is doubled, that she is not whole, since she can also have a relation with that capital phi. So again, you've got the two vectors in this diagram extending from slashed woman. With this final flourish on the feminine subject's doubled relation to signifiers of the barred other and capital phi, I think you have all the key elements and trajectories of the diagram's lower half in place. Make no mistake, we're not done with this, but I think you've got Lacan's gloss on each element and their corresponding vectors in place. On my reading, the key word in the paragraphs we just read, and there are many key words, but the key word on my reading here is relation. Women have relations. And not just to the two signifiers Lacan mentions here, namely the signifier of the big barred other and the signifier without a signify that he designates with that capital phi. Think back to our series on Seminar 16. He also tells us here, in the passage we just considered, that barred woman is related to what can be said of the unconscious, and that catches our attention. What, my friends, can be said of the unconscious? Only what it commands into existence as a symptom, thereby splitting itself into two fields of unknown knowledge, just as we've been discussing them. The first is knowable by way of the symptom, whose interrogation yields enigmatic yet decipherable links to unconscious truths. Truths which can, in turn, be captured in language, and by extension, conscious knowledge. Beyond this field of knowability, however, there's another realm of unknown knowledge, one which resists capture by language and codification in knowledge, and thus remains not only unknown, but, mark my words here, unknowable. We've talked a lot about impossibility. Here we arrive at its correlate in the unconscious, unknowability. There is impossibility, and there is its sibling, unknowability. In our last lecture, it was the unknowable unconscious that primarily concerned us. Here, it's the knowable unconscious that matters most, because we're thinking about what can be said of the unconscious. What can be said of the unconscious points us to what can be known of it. If feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function, and thus impossible, corresponds to the unknowable unconscious, feminine enjoyment within the phallic field, even if only contingently so, corresponds to the knowable unconscious. So there it is. Put bluntly, feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function, that impossible enjoyment, puts us on the path to the unknowable unconscious. But feminine enjoyment within the phallic field, even if only contingently there, that, however, corresponds to the knowable unconscious. And because this is occurring in the same body, it's not like I'm tracing out two columns here. We're looking at an imbricated relation of jouissance between impossibility and contingency, unknowability and knowability in the same body, in the same speaking body, Encore. All of which suggests to me that feminine relations, they're not just doubled, as Lacan says here. I think they're also tripled. Barred woman, as you see it on the screen in front of you, it is indeed related to the signifier of the barred other, just as you see. It is indeed related to the signifier without a signified symbolized by that capital phi. But it is also related to the signifier of the knowable unconscious we call symptom, and beyond it, something else entirely. I think it's precisely here, in this cluster of signifiers, of tripled signifiers, that her corporal knowledge and her contingent enjoyment both take place, allowing us to locate and conceptualize the jouissance of the feminized body in the phallic field, just as Lacan's been discussing it since the start of Seminar 20, namely, as a signal of radical alterity, as the symbol of an impossible other, barred as a result. Remember, it's about the jouissance of the feminized body, where we see corporal knowledge, contingent enjoyment coming to bear. At this point, you know how to read Lacan's backwards capital EX formula for masculine enjoyment, the one that you see in the upper right-hand corner of the chart in front of you. It reads like this: look as hard as you like. You can't find any woman who's not a little or a lot subordinate to the phallic function. There does not exist anyone who's not a little or a lot subordinate to the phallic function. What we're adding here with this emphasis on the feminized body in the phallic field is an emphasis on the lived experience of these bodies who meet this criteria outlined in Lacan's first formula of feminine enjoyment. Look as hard as you like. You can't find any women who aren't a little or a lot subordinate to the phallic function. Let's consider the bodies to which this formula applies, the lived experience at the level of jouissance that these bodies carry with them. In the phallic field, check it out, her knowledge is corporal. Her enjoyment is contingent. Her speech is symptomatic. And her signifier, barred without exception, is that of the barred other and symbolic phallus alike. So if you want to stack up some of the complexities around this body and ask yourself, with what is this body inscribed? It's inscribed with a knowledge that is corporal, felt in her bones, an enjoyment which is contingent, there but didn't have to be, speech which is symptomatic and refers to all aspects of the unconscious, and a signifier, a series of signifiers, barred without exception, that belong to her, the non-existent big other, and that phallus with a capital P. Which brings us, I think, to another key insight. Masculine fantasy is premised on a willful and, technically speaking, idiotic, damn near autistic ignorance of all of this. All the complexity that you just heard me tracing out, where in the phallic field, feminine knowledge is corporal, feminine enjoyment is contingent, feminine speech is symptomatic, and feminine signifiers, hers as well as those of the barred other and the symbolic phallus, never stop popping. All that complexity is utterly, completely fucking lost on the masculine subject. Masculine fantasy, as you see it on the screen with /s pointing to little a, typical of neurotic fantasy, it is premised on a willful, idiotic, and damn near autistic ignorance of all of this complexity occurring on the feminine side of things. The barred subject that each and every masculine subject is only ever approaches the feminine subject as the object cause of his desire, namely as little a. That's how you have to read this vector, and that's why the passage I read from chapter 7 regarding masculine fantasy is so key, because Lacan is explicitly spelling this out. All he ever sees of her is the part that allows him to pretend he's whole. That part object as little a. Indeed, go ahead and draw Lacan's matheme of fantasy, /subject lozenge a. There's not much more to the masculine position. Oh, I should add though, there's not much more to masculinity than the neurotic fantasy, apart from this adamant belief in the very thing that woman signifies as non-existent, the big other. And here I'm thinking of that classic Lacanian big other. And fundamentally beyond it, the one. That's the thing. There's not much more to the masculine position than the basic formula of neurotic fantasy. However, there is also baked into this fantasy, because it's premised on the idea that if you could just find the right part to complete yourself, you would indeed become one with yourself, whole and the like. Anything that has the identity of the one is going to be something that the masculine subject is into. That's why I say there ain't much more to it than fantasy, apart from his adamant belief in the existence of a big, total, complete, universal other. Again, fundamentally, the one. The face of this one is that mythical father, that real man we've been discussing. A God incarnate, you might even be inclined to think, but I wouldn't go too far with that. Let's do some math. /s plus little italicized a equals, in the masculine fantasy, a subject turned mythical father, a multiplicitous subject turned real one. Only insofar as women play their parts as object little a and nothing more, does this masculine wager stand a chance? Or so men tell themselves. That's the key variable here that you have to see, and it's part of why there's so much confusion and discrepancy. Only insofar as she plays her part in masculine fantasy, embracing her being the cause of his desire, and nothing more, does this masculine wager of autonomy, of oneness, of real doggedness stand a chance. Note the triple delusions here. It's important to have this on the table. The masculine fantasy of oneness, accomplished by reducing partners to parts in order to feel whole, is premised on a tripled delusion. First, the masculine subject doesn't realize that he's a split subject, which is why it's so easy to link the master's discourse to that of the masculine subject. Second, the masculine subject doesn't realize either that there's more to his partners than the parts they play in his fantasy. Third delusion on this list. He sure as hell doesn't realize that there's no such thing as an unconstrained, uncastrated, non-subordinate, and wholly autonomous jouissance awaiting him beyond this fantasy. Those are the three delusions. That motherfucker doesn't know he's split. He doesn't see the complexity of his partners because they've been reduced to parts for his surplus enjoyment. And he sure as fuck doesn't see that there is no real dog at the end of that tunnel. But it's the second delusion regarding partners reduced to parts and nothing more that concerns us here. According to Lacan, it's part and parcel of a broader trans-historical confusion in which signifiers of the barred other have been routinely mistaken for object causes of desire. He even goes so far as to suggest that his entire teaching amounts to a prolonged effort to resolve this confusion. Check it out. It's on page 83. It's the passage to which I have returned to the most in thinking through chapter 7. It's worth repeating and rereading. You got to check this thing out. It's on page 83. You're going to love how this pans out. The aim of my teaching, Lacan says, insofar as it pursues what can be said and enunciated on the basis of analytic discourse, is to dissociate objet A from the capital A of the big other, by reducing the first to what is related to the imaginary and the other to what is related to the symbolic. It is indubitable that the symbolic is the basis of what was made into God, which will become significant in the second half of this chapter. It is certain, Lacan continues, that the imaginary is based on the reflection of one semblable in another. And then notice what happens here. And yet, despite this clear distinction between little italicized a as related to the imaginary and capital A as related to the symbolic, Lacan says, and yet, little a has lent itself to be confused with signifiers of the big barred other, below which it is written on the blackboard, and it has done so by means of the function of being. So note on the blackboard, there is no vector connecting that little a to the capital S next to the slashed big A in parens. And what Lacan's saying is that part of the work of this diagram is to help detach these two elements, to show how they are fundamentally distinct in a world that all too often confuses them. Little a has lent itself to be confused with the signifier of the big barred other, below which it is written on the blackboard. He's talking about this diagram. And it is done so by means of the function of being, he says. We'll come back to that in a little while. It is here that a scission or detachment remains to be effectuated. It is in this respect that psychoanalysis is something other than psychology. For psychology is this uneffectuated scission. In psychology, Lacan is here suggesting, what you see is a confusion of objet A and signifiers of the big barred other. Psychoanalysis, though, aims to cut a different path. In fact, I would say that effecting this scission, as he puts it, is among the primary achievements of psychoanalysis, especially after Lacan gets a hold of it. Again, he's talking about his teaching here. He thinks one of his primary tasks is to detach these two things. Indeed, you might even say that this is one of the basic paths of genius available to Lacan. I think there are two. There are folks that show up and are able to see correspondence and connection where everybody else in their time sees only division. Someone shows up and notices a smartphone and a taxi cab and sees a way to connect those two services, hence Uber, Lyft, and other ride-sharing apps. You see, they see connection where others only see difference. That's one type of genius. The other, one which I think is modeled uniquely in the mid-20th century by folks like Lacan, but also Hannah Arendt. She was even better at this than Lacan. The other is to notice difference where others see only similarities. And that's Lacan's wager here, is that the achievement of Lacanian psychoanalysis is to mark out a difference between object causes of desire and signifiers of a desirous big other that everybody else thinks are the same. That's why it's easy to categorize him as a kind of genius thinker, because where everybody else, from Aristotle to modern psychologists, see a correspondence and connection between these two functions, one imaginary and the other symbolic, Lacan sees a radical difference. Explaining all of this, explaining how Lacan's theory of sexuation in particular helps to effect this scission. That's where we're headed now. It's the task now before us. If indeed one of the primary achievements of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Lacan's teaching, as he says, is to effect a separation where everybody else sees an identification, the question in Chapter 7 and the question before us is how? How exactly does this work, and why are we doing this work right now while discussing this diagram of sexuation?